Have you ever thought that sometimes what makes a man's heart nearly stop isn't the crack of a gunshot or the flash of a blade, but a flicker of light glowing from a cabin he swore had been left in darkness? That fragile, wavering glow, like the breath of a stranger, can break through years of silence and remind a man he's not alone anymore. If that thought sends a chill down your back, then stay with me for this story. I promise. By the end, you'll understand why one lantern burning where it shouldn't can change a man's entire fate. But before we ride further, let me pause for just a moment. Don't forget to hit that like button to help keep these frontier tales alive. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from. Maybe a breezy porch out in the country. Maybe a quiet little room in the city. Either way, you're part of bringing the Old West back to life. Now, back to it. It had been another empty day for Elias Ward. The traps he set in the high ridges had yielded nothing but a single skinny rabbit, not worth the miles he'd trudged. He rode home at a steady, resigned pace, just as he had every other evening for years. No warm meal waiting, no voice to greet him, just 4 weathered walls leaning against the wind. But this night was different. Very different. As he approached the low ground where his cabin stood, Elias slowed his horse, his eyes narrowed. From the single window flickered a faint golden glow, a lamp flame, yet he knew without doubt that he had snuffed it out when he left that morning. His pulse hammered. The horse sensed his unease, tossing its head and stamping the earth. Elias slid from the saddle, boots crunching the gravel. He didn't rush. Years in war had taught him haste was just another word for suicide. He moved slow, steady, rifle in hand, eyes fixed on that trembling light. The cabin door, always barred when he left, stood ajar. The wind nudged it against the frame with a dry, groaning creak. Elias lifted the rifle, finger taut on the trigger, and with the muzzle he nudged the door wide. Inside, firelight spilled across the cramped room, and there by the hearth sat someone who did not belong. A woman. Apache. Knees pulled tight to her chest, hair hanging loose in dark, tangled waves. Her dress of deerskin was torn at the seams, dirt ground into every crease, bruises marking her arms and shoulders. Firelight threw those bruises into sharper relief, but it also caught on her face, exhausted, battered, yet with eyes that burned steady and unflinching. Elias held his breath, every muscle in his body tightened like a bowstring. He knew what her presence meant: danger. If she was here, then others, raiders, pursuers, men with rifles, were not far behind. Trouble had walked straight through his door. And yet, she looked directly at him, not with pleading, not with shame, not with fear. Her voice broke the silence, rough and halting, but certain. "I want to stay here." 4 words, sharp as a blade, not begging, not bargaining. A declaration. A choice. Elias's unease didn't ease. It grew heavier, more tangled. This was no passing shadow, no accident. She had chosen his cabin, and in that choice, she forced him to face his own, cast her out into certain death, or let her stay and bring her hunters crashing down on them both. The room seemed to shrink around them. The fire snapped. The wind pressed hard at the roof. 2 sets of eyes locked, one belonging to a man who had buried wife and child, the other to a woman carrying bruises but not defeat. His finger stayed on the trigger, but the shake had left it. Neither moved. The silence thickened until it seemed to speak for them both. And that, dear friends, was the moment another story began. A story where unease and vigilance would not disappear, but draw 2 souls together in a way neither expected. From that night forward, Elias Ward would no longer walk as a man alone, but as someone bound, whether he liked it or not, to the life of a woman who had said, "I want to stay here." Have you ever witnessed a moment when a man knows that just one small choice, just a nod or a shake of the head, could change the course of his whole life? That was what Elias Ward faced when the Apache woman lifted her head and said, "I want to stay here." Those few words, heavy as stone, forced a man who had grown used to emptiness into a crossroad, refuse her and keep safe, or open the door and let trouble step inside. To picture it clearer, put yourself in Elias's boots. For years, he had cooked meals for one, swept the cabin just to keep the dust from piling too high, and spent every night sitting alone with nothing but the wind scraping over the roof. That silence had become his armor. And now, in a single breath, it was cracked wide open. A stranger sat by his fire, bruised, hungry, and surely dragging danger behind her. Elias didn't lower his rifle right away. His hand stayed tight on the trigger, his heartbeat pounding. But the woman's eyes did not flinch. They didn't beg. They didn't plead. They looked at him as if to say, "You can throw me out, but I will not crawl." It was that defiance that made Elias pause. His shoulders dropped half an inch. His breath hissed out through his nose, as if cursing himself for softening. He finally lowered the rifle against the log wall. His voice came rough. "Short, sit closer to the fire." From there, he moved with the quiet rhythm of habit. He pulled the scrawny rabbit off the saddle, took up his knife, and began the old motions. The blade slid through hide and sinew, each cut clean and practiced. He had done it 1,000 times. But tonight he felt heat crawling up his back because he knew a pair of eyes followed every movement. The Apache woman stayed silent, her arms clamped around her knees, her face drawn thin by exhaustion. Elias tried not to look, but when he dropped strips of meat into the pot, he caught her gaze again, and it stopped him cold. Inside him rose two voices, tugging in opposite directions. One whispered, "Fear. She's not alone. Someone's out there. Raiders. Bounty men. If you keep her here, you'll draw the wolves straight to your door." The other murmured mercy. "Look at the bruises on her arm. Look at the way she drinks water like it's the last she'll ever have. She doesn't need another door slammed in her face." And for reasons he couldn't fully name. Elias listened to the second. He poured water into a battered tin cup and held it out. The woman snatched it, drinking so fast the water spilled down her chin, soaking into the torn hide at her chest. Elias turned his eyes away, ashamed at the sudden sting in his chest. How thirsty must someone be to swallow like that? Soon the pot of rabbit and beans simmered, filling the air with a heavy warmth. He ladled out a tin bowl and passed it to her without a word. She hesitated, then ate. The first bites were sharp and hurried, like a wild thing afraid its food might be snatched away. Gradually she slowed, chewing, pausing, glancing at him as if testing his patience. That silence between them was not peace. It was taut, like a rope pulled tight, half suspicion, half endurance. And all the while, Elias's mind circled the same tormenting question. Send her out into the night, or let her stay by the fire. The weight of it hung heavy as the wind outside. When at last she set the bowl down, Elias asked the thing that had been gnawing at him. "What's your name?" Her lips pressed together, like the word itself was dangerous. Then, at last, she said softly, "Aiyana." The name echoed in the cabin, filling the emptiness with something new. She was no longer just a stranger. She was Aiyana, and that meant Elias had already stepped across the line because once a name is spoken, it carries weight, and weight carries responsibility. He leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the fire. Still the fear pressed hard. Have I just dragged death into my own house? But it was too late to untie what had already been knotted. Water had been shared, Food had been passed. A name had been spoken. And from that night forward, the cabin would no longer belong to one man alone. A thread thin, fragile, but undeniable had been tied between Elias Ward and Aiyana. It might become the rope that would hang them both, or it might be the first lifeline pulling a heart, long dead to the world, back into the land of the living. There's a truth most folks won't admit. Trust doesn't come from fine promises. It comes from the small, repeated things, quiet gestures that slowly remind a man he isn't alone. And that was how Aiyana began to leave her mark inside the cabin that had only ever known one set of hands. The next morning, when Elias stirred awake from a restless sleep in his wooden chair, he caught the faint smell of smoke already rising. In the corner, the fire had been stoked, ash neatly swept, and dry wood stacked in an orderly row. He frowned not in anger, but in surprise. He'd grown used to doing every chore himself, from feeding the fire to shoveling the ashes. Yet this time, it was done before he even stood. Aiyana sat on the floor, her torn deerskin dress drawn tight around her, working a needle through a rip in his old coat. The metal glinted in the firelight, each stitch tighter than he expected from someone so worn down. Elias stood there a long while, caught between confusion and a strange pull in his chest. He cleared his throat, forcing his voice to stay hard. "You don't need to be doing that." Aiyana lifted her head, her dark eyes steady. She didn't answer, just gave a short nod and went back to her sewing, as if to say the work wasn't about earning his permission, but about proving she wasn't here to take without giving. Elias turned away, went outside to split wood, trying to steady himself. But when he returned, the old coat no longer hung in tatters. It looked serviceable again, ready to keep out the cold. He didn't speak thanks, but his hand lingered on the fresh stitches longer than he meant to, as if the thread itself carried a message. You're not entirely alone anymore. Over the days that followed, the cabin began to show her hand. She found a worn broom in the corner and swept the boards clean. She laid stones along the doorframe to block the night wind. By noon, when Elias hauled water back from the creek, the bucket was already brimming, her hands red and raw from the icy current, her eyes glinting with a flicker of pride. Watching her, Elias felt an ache he hadn't expected, memories of the wife he had buried years before, the woman who had once moved quietly through this same space, mending, tending, keeping order without asking for praise. The thought stung, but it also cracked something open inside him. For the first time in years, he felt a pang of empathy instead of suspicion. Friends. You may ask, why would a man so guarded begin to accept a stranger under his roof? The answer wasn't in anything spoken. It was in the sights and sounds when he came home. The cabin that had once held nothing but wind and creaking wood now carried the smell of smoke, the scrape of fabric, the faint nod of acknowledgement from Aiyana. Small things, yes, but enough to soften the weight of solitude that had pressed on him so long. One afternoon, Elias pushed through the door with a few scrawny squirrels caught in his traps. He froze in the threshold. Aiyana was crouched by the hearth, blowing gently on the embers, her long hair falling across her face, firelight catching in her eyes. On the table, a blanket had been patched. In the pot, beans were simmering. For the first time in years, his cabin didn't look like a shell leaning against the wind. It looked lived in. He set the game down, letting out a long breath. Aiyana lifted her gaze, met his eyes, and gave the smallest nod. No words. But Elias understood she was saying, "I'm not just a burden. I want to be here. I am helping this place survive." And something shifted inside him. Not enough to make him put the rifle away at night. Not enough to erase the shadow of danger beyond the hills. But enough to let him wonder if her presence might bring more than trouble. enough to let him imagine that perhaps she was rekindling a fire he thought had gone cold forever. So it went. In each fire kindled, each coat mended, each floor swept clean. The distance between them narrowed. The silence grew less sharp. And out of that silence, something new was taking root. Empathy first, then the fragile beginnings of trust. Out on the frontier, there's a kind of silence more dangerous than the crack of a rifle. It's the silence of being surrounded. And that was the silence pressing in on Elias Ward that morning. He had risen early, rifle on his shoulder, heading toward the snare lines deeper in the woods, but near the creek bed, his battle-worn eyes caught what others might miss. In the damp earth, still heavy with dew, lay 3, no, maybe 4 boot prints, broad, heavy, cut deep, the stride long, the weight of men carrying rifles. They weren't old. The edges were sharp, fresh. Whoever made them had passed only hours before. Elias crouched low, fingers brushing the cold mud. His heart thudded, but his face stayed stone. He counted the rhythm of their steps, measured their weight, judged their pace. These weren't hunters after game. These were men moving with intent, and if he had found their trail, it meant they were close enough to be watching his cabin already. Then it came the voice, rough, deliberate, mocking, stretched out into a taunt. Aiyana. Elias held his breath. That voice didn't belong to a friend. It rasped with cruelty, followed by a laugh like broken iron. He knew that kind of man, the sort who hunted people the way others hunted deer, who took joy in the chase. He turned back toward the cabin, every step measured. He didn't run. Running gave you away, but each footfall carried the tension of a man who knew danger was near, nearer than it had ever been. Inside, Aiyana looked up from the hearth as soon as the door opened. She read the truth in his face before he spoke. Her shoulders stiffened, the needle in her hand frozen in mid-stitch. "They're here?" she asked softly. Elias set the rifle down on the table, pulled off his gloves, and gave a curt nod. Boot tracks. 3, maybe 4. They're still out there. Her eyes dropped, voice no more than a whisper. They never stop, always chasing, always taking back. The words lodged like stones in Elias's gut. Every syllable confirmed what his instincts had warned by letting her in. He had brought the storm to his own doorstep. For years, he had survived by keeping his world small, by staying alert and avoiding entanglements. Now, all that danger was pressing in, funneling toward his cabin walls. He moved to the window, peering through the dust-clouded glass. Trees swayed in the wind, but no animal stirred. The silence hung heavy, the same kind he remembered from nights before enemy lines broke in war. Friends, you may be wondering why not just push her out, send her back into the dark, and keep himself safe. The answer was simple. Elias had seen the bruises circling her arms, had heard the weariness in her voice. She wasn't running from shadows. She was running from men who treated her like property. To drive her out now would be the same as pulling the trigger himself. So he chose. He picked up the rifle again, wiped the stock clean, checked the chamber. His movements were steady, but different now. Each motion carried weight. He wasn't just maintaining a weapon, he was preparing to turn his cabin into a stronghold. Across the room, Aiyana fed more wood into the fire, set the kettle by the coals. Small motions. But Elias noticed the way her hands shook, the way her lips pressed thin. She was afraid, but she stayed. Her eyes flicked toward him now and again, as if drawing strength from his presence. The cabin filled with a thick, taut silence. Elias dragged a chair to the window, laid the rifle across his knees, and fixed his gaze on the trees. Every whisper of wind, every crack of a branch snapped him to attention. He sat coiled like a drawn bow, while behind him, Aiyana kept to the fire through her eyes, from time to time, lingered on him as if clinging to the steadiness in his posture. Time stretched heavy. Then the voice came again, closer this time, louder, mocking. Another burst of harsh laughter followed. Elias tightened his grip on the rifle, jaw set. He couldn't see them. Not yet. But he knew. They were probing, testing, circling. He leaned just enough to murmur, his words low, meant for her ears only. "Stay inside. I'll handle it." She studied him, eyes dark, as if weighing whether he meant it. After a long moment, she gave a slow nod. Right then, Elias realized he had crossed a line. She was no longer simply a stranger under his roof. She was someone he had chosen to protect. And the cabin, once no more than a shelter against the wind, had become a fortress. And Elias Ward, for better or worse, had just taken his stand. On the frontier, some storms come down as if hurled by the very hand of God without warning, without mercy, breaking whatever dares to stand against them. And on that gray afternoon, as Elias Ward still sat by the window with his rifle across his knees, watching the timber line where hunters might lurk, the sky shifted. Black clouds rolled in from the north, thick as smoke, swallowing the ridges whole. Wind howled through the cracks of the cabin, rattling every loose board. Elias heard it first as a low whistle in the seams of the roof, then felt the first cold drop strike his weathered hand. "Storm's coming," he muttered, rising to his feet. There was no time to brace. Rain slammed down in sheets, driven sideways by a gale that struck like a whip. The roof leaked within minutes, water dripping in thin lines along the log walls. Aiyana sprang to the hearth, snatching a scrap of hide, trying to wedge it against the gaps. Elias pushed through the door, shoulders hunched against the blast, gripping the roof where the boards had begun to tear loose. The wind shoved him sideways, rain lashing his face raw. He braced himself with one arm, hammer in the other, forcing nails into the wood while his hands numbed with cold. Inside, Aiyana clambered onto a chair, bare feet slipping on the wet boards, pressing hide and cloth against the leaks. Every time she lifted her hand, water burst through, soaking her thin dress until it clung to her skin. Once she slipped, balance breaking. Elias let go of the hammer, caught her by the arm, and pulled her hard against him. For a breath, her soaked body leaned into his chest, her heart hammering, her hair plastered against his shirt. Smoke, wet leather, and fear clung together in that moment. He held her a second too long, then released, jaw tight, as if her warmth was more dangerous than the storm itself. "Hold it steady." "I'll nail it from the top," he barked over the roar. She nodded, lips blue, hands trembling but unyielding as she pressed the patch into place. Elias climbed back onto the roof, hammer blows ringing sharp against the downpour. Wind shrieked, nails groaned, but each strike was defiance. Inside, Aiyana held fast, shoulders shaking, refusing to let the storm tear through. Friends, if you've ever been caught in a storm out here, you know it's not just a fight with weather, it's a trial of will. Each gust asks, will you let go? Or will you hold on? And together. Elias and Aiyana answered by refusing to yield. When at last the worst had passed, they collapsed by the fire, both drenched, breath smoking in the cold air. Aiyana pulled the blanket tight across her shoulders, still shivering, but her eyes burned steady. Elias looked at her, and in his chest rose a feeling he dared not name. That was when she spoke, voice ragged but unbroken. "You look, but you do not take." The words cut sharp through the dripping silence. They were not just a warning. They were a recognition. She saw him for what he was and what he was not. He looked, yes, but unlike the men who had hunted her, Elias did not cross the line. The cabin filled with a new kind of quiet, Not suspicion, not mistrust, but a fragile trust taking root between them. Elias wrapped his hand tighter around the stock of his rifle, realizing it was no longer only for himself. He was holding it for her, too. Outside, the storm still raged, battering the roof, tearing at the walls. But inside, something had shifted. From the moment Aiyana spoke those words, a line had been drawn between them. Not just a boundary, but the beginnings of a bond. Elias sat straighter, breath deep, eyes fixed on the window. Within him, the decision set hard as stone if those men came back. He would not hand her over. The storm had proved something. Aiyana wasn't a burden. She was someone who had fought beside him against the fury of the wind. And to Elias Ward, that was worth more than all the false safety in the world. There are nights on the frontier so thick you can hear your own heartbeat louder than the wind outside. And on that night, after the storm, that heavy silence wrapped itself around Elias Ward's cabin. The hunters hadn't left, somewhere in the darkness. They lingered, mocking calls drifting through the trees, laughter sharp as broken glass. Yet strangely, they never came closer. Maybe they feared the man sitting by the window with a rifle laid across his knees. Maybe they wanted to savor the chase, to stretch fear out like a game. Whatever the reason, their shadows still circled, like wolves refusing to leave the edge of camp. Inside the cabin, the air was taut. Each creak of timber in the wind made Aiyana stiffen. She huddled near the fire, a blanket pulled around her shoulders, eyes fixed on the glow of embers. Elias hadn't moved from his chair, rifle heavy across his lap, gaze locked on the window. He knew they were out there, even if he couldn't see them. Friends, you might ask what kept his hand steady, what stopped fear from overwhelming him. The answer lay in the silence he shared. Elias was no longer alone. Across the fire sat Aiyana, the woman who had stood with him against the storm. The woman who had told him plain, "You look, but you do not take." That truth bound him tighter than any duty. The wind rattled the roof, then eased. Night deepened. The sounds in the woods thinned out, fading to a distance. Elias finally exhaled, lowering the rifle beside his chair, his shoulders sagging with the weight of long hours. He turned and met her eyes. In the dim light, her gaze burned brighter than the fire. No trace of pleading, no fear, only choice. Her voice came rough but certain. "I stay because I choose." The words struck the room like a hammer driving a stake. Not begging, not asking leave. It was a declaration her right to remain, claimed by her own will. Elias froze. In all his years, he'd seen people cornered by fate, stripped of choice. Yet here sat a woman beaten, hunted, and still she spoke with the authority of someone unbroken. Inside his chest, something gave way like a latch finally breaking loose. He rose slowly, boots heavy against the boards. She did not shrink back. She sat upright, eyes locked on his. He stopped before her, hand rough and trembling as it brushed her arm. She didn't pull away. Her breath caught, lips parting, gaze unwavering. The kiss came slow, deliberate, not desperate, not forceful. It was the slow breaking of a dam, the release of silence held too long. It carried no hunger for conquest, only the fragile trust built in firelight, in danger, in restraint. Her hand pressed against his chest, fingers curling into the worn fabric as if to anchor herself. Elias closed his eyes, letting the moment settle deep, his heart beating in a rhythm he thought he'd buried with his past. When they parted, their foreheads stayed pressed together, breaths mingling. Aiyana whispered, voice raw but sure, "No more running." Elias's reply rumbled low, heavy as stone, "No more." The silence that followed wasn't suspicion, wasn't fear. It was agreement, a bond sealed in quiet, in a kiss given with choice, Outside, the danger still prowled. The hunters would come again. But inside those log walls, two strangers had chosen to stand together, and in that choice lay the turning point. Elias sat back, rifle still within reach, but the weight of it no longer felt the same, because now, when his eyes cut to the fire, he found hers waiting. He wasn't keeping guard for himself alone anymore. There comes a time, after too many years of scraping by in half-light, when a man can no longer live in the gray. He must either step forward or step aside. And in that small cabin, on that long night, Elias Ward knew he had reached that point. Outside, the frontier darkness was still heavy, hiding the hunters who lingered beyond the ridge. But inside, the fire threw a warm glow across the room, tracing the lines of two faces, no longer strangers. Aiyana sat close to the hearth, her long black hair loose over her shoulders, her dark eyes steady. From the moment she had said, "I stay because I choose," and answered his slow, certain kiss, the wall between them had begun to crumble. Elias sat in silence, his calloused hand resting on the rifle beside him. For years, he had lived wrapped in suspicion, but now he knew if she was to remain, it had to be more than silent gestures, more than glances exchanged across firelight. It had to be spoken aloud, a line carved in stone. He rose, boots heavy on the wooden floor, each step echoing like a drumbeat in his chest. Aiyana lifted her head but did not shrink back. Her eyes held his, steady, waiting. Elias drew a breath, voice low and rough as he spoke. "This is your home now. If you stay as mine." The fire popped. The cabin fell still. Those words weren't permission. They weren't the grudging allowance of a man tolerating company. They were a vow, a bond forged in the weight of choice. The cabin would no longer be his alone. And if she stayed as part of him. Aiyana didn't rush to answer. She searched his eyes a long moment, measuring him, as if making certain this was no fleeting weakness. Then, with quiet strength, she gave her reply. "I stay." 2 words. Simple. Final. Yet they struck harder than any bullet Elias had ever faced. Heat surged through him, the kind that doesn't come from fire but from life itself, breaking through years of cold silence. He reached out, rough palm pressing against her shoulder, not to claim, but to affirm. "I heard you. I believe you." Friends, if you've ever lost everything and thought there was nothing left worth holding, you'll know the weight of that moment. It was no longer about fate pressing them together. It was about a choice, 2 choices, meeting in the same space. Elias pulled a chair closer, sitting beside her now. His rifle remained within reach, but his eyes no longer stayed fixed on the window. Instead, they lingered on her face, the bruises fading, the stitches she had sewn, the quiet pride in every gesture. He didn't see a burden anymore. He saw a companion, a reason to keep standing when the world outside pressed hard. Aiyana, too, had shifted. From the instant she said, "I stay," her posture straightened, her gaze shone brighter. She was no longer a guest clinging to mercy. She was the keeper of her own choice, and the cabin was no longer just his. It was theirs. She touched the log wall with her fingertips, tracing the worn grain as if claiming it with that small motion. This is home. That night, they sat long by the fire, no need for many words. Every glance, every silence, spoke louder than voices outside. The hunters might still circle, but Elias knew he would stand firm now. Because for the first time in years, he wasn't standing for himself alone. And as the fire sank low, his heart carried 2 words he would never forget. "I stay." Not a request, not a plea, but a vow, answered and bound in the stillness of a frontier night. There are seasons in a man's life when, after storms and struggle, the days grow quiet like a still pond after the wind has passed. And for Elias Ward, the days that followed became just that. The hunters had vanished. Whether they gave up or turned their malice elsewhere, Elias never knew. What mattered was their voices no longer echoed in the night. No footsteps stalked the tree line. Only the valley wind carried through the grass. The creek hummed below, and the steady smoke of a hearth rose from the roof of a cabin, now repaired and standing firmer than before. Aiyana was no longer a silent guest by the fire. She stepped into the open air. Sowing seed in rows, Elias had turned with his spade. Her hands worked the earth, fingernails blackened with soil. But her eyes shone bright with hope. Tiny green shoots soon pushed from the dirt, and with them came the promise of a season not only for the land, but for 2 lives that had been wandering in emptiness. Each morning, Elias carried water from the creek, shoulders straining under the weight, but his heart unburdened. Aiyana hung the clothes he washed, set the dishes neatly on the table, kept the hearth warm. The leaks in the roof he could not patch alone she stitched with hide, binding scraps of wood and leather with a care that, though rough, held true. What once looked like scars on the cabin began to resemble marks of perseverance. Sometimes, as Elias worked along the fence line, he would glance back and see her bring a cup of water, setting it down on a rail without a word. He answered with a nod. She answered with a faint smile. And in those wordless exchanges, trust deepened more than speeches ever could. Friends, if you've ever lived through long stretches of loneliness, you'll understand how powerful the smallest gestures can be. A cup placed in your hand, a roof that no longer leaks when it rains, a voice quietly calling your name. Those little things, gathered together, are the very definition of home. Winter eased its grip. The frost melted, the ground softened, and the stream swelled under the spring sun. Birds returned to the trees. The cabin that had once been Elias Ward's fortress of solitude now became the home of Elias and Aiyana. He realized he was no longer just a man keeping fire alive for himself. He was a man expected at the table, a man whose return was watched for at the door, a man who heard soft words whispered sometimes only. You're home. One bright afternoon, as sun poured over the young shoots in the garden, Elias leaned against the fence and watched Aiyana gather wood. He no longer saw only the Apache woman who had arrived beaten and hunted. He saw the one who had chosen to stand beside him, who had turned silence into life. His heart stirred in a way he had thought buried forever. He said quietly, voice gravelly, yet warm, I thought love was buried with my wife and child, but now I see it standing here again. Aiyana set her bundle down, walked to him, and placed her dirt-stained hand over his. She said nothing. She didn't need to. That single touch carried all the words he'd been afraid to hope for. Friends, this is the truth I want you to feel. Sometimes love doesn't come from searching. It comes from the stubborn choice to stay, to build, to live again. Elias never asked fate to deliver him anything. He only opened a door, and Aiyana walked through it, carrying the spark of rebirth. By spring, the valley was green. Smoke rose steady from the chimney. Dried corn hung on the eaves as a promise of plenty. Aiyana shook out the patched blanket and laughed softly when the breeze caught it. That evening, they sat side by the fire. No rifle propped against his chair, no ears straining for threats beyond the wall. Only the peace of a spring night, the snap of wood in the hearth. Elias wrapped his arm around her shoulders, slowly, gently, as if relearning how to live, how to trust, how to love. And so the circle closed. From suspicion and storms to trust and renewal, Elias had found what he thought was lost love, home, and a life worth living again. But the question remains for Elias, and perhaps for us as well. What comes next should he keep this fragile peace private, guarding it as his own, Or should he open it wider? Invite community. Let others see that this cabin, once a fortress, has become a home of warmth and welcome. My friends, I invite you to stand with Elias Ward, a man who thought his days would end in silence, but who has found a reason to step back into life. Tell me in the comments if you were him. What would you choose? Hold tight to the quiet haven he and Aiyana have built, or take the next step and share that peace with the world beyond the ridge? Either way, one truth is sure: their story reminds us that in the harshest places, love is not given, it is chosen, and that choice can save a life.